LSD, the desert Southwest, being chased by Indians, and how I got here. This is the story of my life and how I became a lifelong river guide and ended up in the Philippines, almost ready to retire. So let's not waste time, let's get started. My last How I Got Here 4 ended with me dropping out of college, living in Buena Vista, Colorado in a tent in the Mosquito range. So as I said in the last part, I'm not going to get too into it, but me and my roommate Kurt moved up into the rocks, into a tent. We're living in a tent together in the Mosquito range in Colorado, just outside of Buena Vista, Colorado. Kurt had to go home, like I said at the end of the last one. His sister died suddenly, so he left. He was gone. He was out of the picture. Now, this is the early 90s. There's no cell phones. Whenever I wanted to call home or make a call, I had to go down to town. There was a community center in Buena Vista. There was a row of payphones there, and I would call home if I wanted to call my mom. A lot of you probably never saw these, but they used to have these phone cards. You'd buy one for like $20, and it would give you so many calls on a payphone.
Back what a payphones used to be.
So many minutes, so you could spend that time on a payphone. The community center also had public showers, so I was living up in the rocks there, 2-mile hike from town. Obviously there was no water up there. This is the desert, Colorado high altitude desert. So maybe once a week or so I would go down to the community center. It cost 4 quarters for a 5-minute shower. Sometimes I would indulge and use 8 quarters and take a 10-minute shower. Other days when I didn't shower, I would jump in the Arkansas River. Freezing cold water in the 40s Fahrenheit, 41, 42 degrees Fahrenheit, even a little colder in the spring. But that's how I bathed most of the time. My water for the campsite, I would haul up there. But anyway, Kurt had gone. I was by myself, living in the rocks, fending off the mountain lions and bears, and just getting by up there. But I knew any day now I was going to start training to be a whitewater raft guide with independent whitewater. The guy who ran Independent Whitewater, he was my supervisor for ski instructing, Bill Block. He was a real character, you know, he's like a Hey Duke type character from the Monkey Wrench gang. Speaking of which, at this time I read a lot. You can imagine I was living in the mountains there by myself, so I was reading the Monkey Wrench gang, Edward Abbey, Jack Kerouac, On the Road, what else? Hunter S. Thompson, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, The Great Shark Hunt, which details his hate for Richard Nixon. Anyway, if you're interested in those books, I'll link some of them in the description at the end of this video. But so that was what I was reading. So that was my influence at the time. I mean, I was a real vagabond at the time. But anyway, I was getting into this whitewater raft guiding because I had nothing else to do. I needed a job. It seems like a good job to have for the summer. Like I said, there was no phone. So Bill Block, the guy I was going to work for, couldn't get in touch with me. So him and a couple of the guys from the crew came up driving around Buena Vista. They lived in Salida, about 30 miles away.
That he's looking for him?
Looking for me. And I just happened to be walking down the side of the road at that time. I remember Dave, one of the other guides, he was also a ski instructor with me. He told me afterwards that he said to Bill, "Hey, did Chris grow a goatee? Because that guy walking by looked just like Chris." And I did happen. That was the first time I grew a goatee. Before then, I had a New York style mustache. But anyway, they pulled over and they're like, "Hey, you taking this training with us or what?" You know, and I was like, "Yes, I'm taking the training." They're like, "All right, meet us here tomorrow. We're going to head out to the San Juan and Southwest Colorado, Utah border, Southwest Desert, and our first week of training is going to be on the San Juan River." Great. I packed up my stuff. Next couple of days, I went down there and met them. We drove the 5 or 6 hours, whatever it is, over to the San Juan River, and I began my training as a whitewater raft guide.
Because we're going to start the training.
So the San Juan trip, you know, the first day of the trip, they were teaching me how to tie gear in a raft and all that stuff. And since I was the new guy, the newbie, the rookie, the youngest guy on the trip probably, they said, "Okay, so what you're going to be in charge of the whole trip is you're not going to touch any food. You'll do some camp setup and stuff and clean up, but you're not going to make any food." You know, on a river trip, you have food crews. So like, say you have 3 different crews. One crew will do the dinner, the breakfast and the lunch, and the next crew will take over for the next dinner, breakfast, lunch, usually crews of like 3 or 4 people. We had about 12 people on this trip, so we had 3 or 4 crews of 3 or 4 people. But I wasn't on any of those crews. I was in charge of the groover. If you don't know what a groover is, it's where everybody goes to the bathroom, takes a dump on a river trip. You're obviously on these pristine rivers in the Southwest, the desert, where if you just, took a shit anywhere,
I'm gonna take a shit.
it would end up not decomposing for a long time, and there'd be crap everywhere. Like there is on some rivers that aren't regulated. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. It's a story for a different time. But anyway, I was in charge of the groover. The reason it was called a groover and not a toilet is because what they used back in the day was these ammo cans that they used to, during the war, Vietnam, Korea, and I still probably today, they carried 50 caliber bullets in. So it's a metal can about a rectangle like this big, and you'd sit on it. So you'd sit on it and you'd get grooves in your butt, and that's how it got called a groover. But so every day we had this routine. So you take enough groovers or these metal cans and they have a rubber seal. So when you seal them shut, when one's full, it goes in the boats and you empty them in special sanitation places at the end of the trip. So I was in charge of the groover. So I had to be very, very clean, washing my hands after I was done every day. And every day when you get to camp, you go set up the groover in a spot away from camp. It usually has a nice view. Everybody likes a nice view with the groover. And you put some chemicals in it. I think it was bleach and maybe, I can't remember what I put in it at the time. Now they just have chemicals that you pre-buy in a bottle. I think it was like bleach and baking soda or something I put in there at the time. So anyway, I was in charge of the groover. First day of the trip, I was really excited. I'd never been on a multi-day river trip. We were going to spend 6 days on the river, camping and floating down the river, covering about 80 miles through Mexican Utah. So some of the guys on this trip I knew from being ski instructors with them. This one older guy, Murdoch, who I had bonded with. He was from New York. He was in his 40s at the time. Obviously, he was a lot older than me, but we had bonded. I remember I didn't really do much drugs at the time, but I had gone through a little drug phase much earlier in life, like 8th grade.
Drugs!
So I went through those drug phases, but got out of it and got back into sports in high school. And if you're interested in that, you can watch my How I Got There Part 2, I think. But anyway, Murdoch once in a while would give me pop brownies at work as ski instructors, which broke up the monotony of the day a lot. But anyway, when we got on this trip, we started floating down the river. The first thing Murdoch does is gives me a hit of LSD. And I was like, oh, I haven't taken LSD since I was like 13 years old. And yes, I took LSD for the first and last time when I was like 13, 14 years old. Up until this point.
Let's talk about LSD. Children, LSD is bad.
I was like, okay, what the hell, It's, a river trip. We're floating on the river. It's the beautiful Southwest Desert Canyon, the red rocks, pristine, all that. It's beautiful. So I take the LSD and we get to lunch, on these river trips, you stop for lunch, you eat and stuff. And at lunch, he gave me some pop brownie seed, and I was like, oh, what the hell? I'm already on LSD. I'll eat a pop brownie too. The lunch spot, everybody basically by that time was on some kind of hallucinogen, LSD, mushrooms.
They was tripping.
So we decided that would be a good idea to just stay there and camp the night. And this is where the story gets interesting. So people start setting up their tent and stuff, and this other guy, Dave, who's like 30, called him Big Dave. He was tall, like 6'4", 6'5". He says, hey, Chris, let's go for a hike, and I'm on LSD. I'm starting to trip, what we called it back in the day, tripping, right? And so I'm like, okay, Dave, well, let's go for a hike. Start hiking around. If you know how the Southwest canyons are, they're kind of like almost these even tiered canyon walls. Like you can hike up one, you find a path up it, but it's pretty much a vertical wall. And then you can hike up another and you go up each tier. So we go up the first tier and we're looking down back at the trail that we just hiked on, and we see that there's a bobcat, which I've never seen before in my life, tracking our trail back up the canyon. And we're like, wow, that's cool, and everything. But we're not scared because a bobcat is not a dangerous animal for a human being. They're much smaller. They're only, a little bigger than a house cat. So like, that's cool, and then, so we see the bobcat, but we keep hiking, and then we kind of split up. We come across these dwellings, which the Anasazi people lived in these lands, this desert Southwest, like 1,000 years ago, and then they disappeared. There's a lot of theories on what happened to them. They commingled with other tribes. They disappeared because they ran out of water. Drought is one of the theories, and they headed south to Mexico. Nobody really knows what happened to the Anasazi. If you're familiar with Mesa Verde down in that area, that's a giant Anasazi dwellings. We came upon these Anasazi dwellings that were just there. Nobody was around. We did see a couple cows. I remember the cactus there at the time was spring in the Southwest, and they had yellow and red flowers. And by this time I was tripping so hard on the LSD. I'm looking at these cactuses and the yellow and red flowers. I'm against the red dirt of the Southwest. It's just like, I'm totally engulfed in these. And I had no idea where Dave was, but these dwellings that we found, dwellings are like cave structures that they lived in. They had little climbing holes up the rocks, and they'd be multi-tiered. And there was like broken pottery in them. This is the early 90s. These days, these dwellings are well protected. They're in national parks. But back then,
relatively unprotected.
They weren't protected. They were just open for use. So we're checking them out and we're gone for hours. Like, we lose track of time. We're up in these dwellings, gone for hours. And finally we start, maybe coming down a little from our trips, where the LSD's wearing off. So we're like, well, we better head back to camp. It's getting late. It's 4 or 5 in the afternoon, going to get dark in an hour or two. So it was a pretty long hike back to camp. We get back to the river level. We're walking across this big field, and all of a sudden, we're still feeling the LSD a little. We look up, and Dave says to me, he's like, "Is there an Indian charging at us right now on a white horse?" And I look up and I say, "Yeah, there's an Indian charging at us on a white horse." And
Holy shit!
you could tell he was an Indian right away, or Native American. He had a headband on, long black hair. He was wearing a shirt, but he's on a white horse, riding bareback, charging at us full speed. And we're just like, oh my God, what's going on here?
What the fuck?
So he charges full up to us. He's got a silver pistol, a sidearm, and he pulls it out and he starts waving it. And he says in kind of a broken English, he's like, "You guys need to get out of here right now. This is Indian land. This is reservation land," which we had no idea this was reservation land. He's like, "Get out of here right now. Your friends are gone. I chased them off." Something to that effect. I don't know. It was over 30 years ago. I don't remember what he said. And so me and Dave looked towards the river, which was still quite a way off, a few miles, and started basically sprinting to the river away from this Indian. And he was following us on the white horse. We're going through bramble, like sticker bushes, getting all cut up and everything. Finally, we get back to camp, and all that's left is Dave's tent, which he set up at lunch before we left, and our bills bags, which are like the big plastic kind of dry bags that you take down the river with all your clothes and stuff in them. So my bills bag, Dave's bills bag, one out of the 5 rafts we had, and Dave's tent, like I said. So we're like, all right, what are we going to do now? It's dusk. It's getting dark.
Now where do we go?
We take down Dave's tent as quick as we can. We throw everything in the raft, and we jump in, and we start floating. Neither one of us really knew the river, but we knew there wasn't like really bad whitewater on it. So we start floating down the river. A couple hours later, now it's fully dark out. We see a fire on the side of the river. We're like, thank God. We get down there, and it's our group.
Oh, thank God, thank God, thank God.
We pulled over. They explained to us that, yeah, the Indian had chased them out of there. We were on reservation land, which we didn't know, which is completely illegal to camp on at the time. But we meet back up with them. We camp there for the night. Everything's fine. Turns out to be, a great trip. I probably haven't taken so many hallucinogens since that trip.
This is your brain on drugs.
But, I was reading Edward Abbey at the time, like I said, the Monkey Wrench Gang. We were hanging out on the river every day, chilling out, enjoying the whitewater. The first time I ever went kayaking was on this trip. It was pretty mellow whitewater. So the trip ended. We went back to Buena Vista. I was officially a guide in training now. like I said in my last How I Got Here, I had no way to pay for training. At the time, it cost like $300 to train, but I had no money. I wasn't even working at the ski area at the time anymore. I was barely eating. But Bill owned a motel where IW was kind of his office and a motel. And I painted that whole motel was the work I had to do to pay off my training. I spent the next couple weeks 5-6 weeks training as a raft guide on the Arkansas. It was high water back then. You know, it hardly ever gets as high as it was then anymore because of the drought in the Southwest desert or in Colorado in general. But I was training. It was high water the whole time. I was having my ups and downs. This other kid, Chris, was training. It was Chris and Chris. We were the only two training and painting the motel together. We became good friends. A few weeks later, maybe 5 weeks later, I got my first commercial trip where I was going to get paid. And usually on commercial trips, you get tipped as well. I was really excited, me and Chris, and it happened to be a school group so I was excited to do this first trip. It was 3,800 CFS on the Arkansas. The group coming down was students from my school, Western State. I didn't really know any of them from there. I only went there for a semester. It was a bunch of students. I think we had 4 or 5 rafts full of students. They were camping at the IW campground, which was at the takeout where we finished the raft trip every time. It was also a campground that Bill Block owned as well. My first commercial trip, very high water. The water hardly even gets this high anymore on the Arkansas these days, like I said, with the drought. But one of the first rapids is called the Silver Bullet Dam. It's an old miner's dam that's been like blown through, but it makes this big, what we call a hydraulic wave that flips rafts and stuff. And after it is a section called the Miracle Mile, especially at that level, the water is just nonstop for a mile or more. And I mean, since that time, you know, I've done many years guiding on the Arkansas. I've seen 2 deaths on that section of river. And that's just what I've seen. There's been many more there just because of the speed of the water. People flush drown, especially at high water levels like it was this day. So my first trip out of training, we have a bunch of students. You know, I'm stoked. I'm going to go down the river. I'm going to get paid finally, even though we were getting paid $50 a day plus tips. I knew I wasn't going to get a tip because they were college students, but that's okay. The $50 was a ton of money to me at the time. So we put it in Buena Vista. You know, we're doing a 20-something miles for the day, which is pretty quick at that water level, 4 or 5 hours with lunch. But we run the first rapid. It's called BV Falls. It's like class 4, some big hits, which are waves. We call them hits, wave, water over the boat and stuff. We get to the Silver Bullet Dam, and I hit the wave wrong in a wrong angle, and I dump truck my boat, what we call a dump truck, where everybody falls out basically. But the boat didn't flip over. It landed back upright again. But I'm out and everybody else is out. I have all these girls in my boat, some cute girls and stuff, and flushing down the water super quick. You know, I'm swimming. The raft is really far away from me. The other guides are trying to save my people. They're helping me out. I'm swimming to the side of the river. I get caught on a log jam. I do what they tell you not to do. I grab a strainer. I use all my strength at the time. I had no money at the time, but I had a lot of strength. I was just working all the time. I use all the power in my body and pull myself up on top of the strainer against the power of the white water trying to suck me under. Get out of the river, run down the bank, get to my boat. Everybody's okay. Thank God nobody died.
Close one.
I get back in the raft, finish the trip for the day, and we get to camp that night. And this is my first whitewater trip, my first day as a commercial whitewater guide, and I have like almost a disaster. The one thing that happened was one of the girls on my boat, Greta, who went to my school I had never met before, she looked at me as like her hero for some reason. And then I'm hooking up with her that night, and we ended up dating for a while. In fact, she lived in Gunnison, so for the rest of that summer, I would go to Gunnison to do my radio show, which I spoke of on Friday nights in my last video. I would do my radio show in Gunnison, and I would hitchhike there. Crazy times doing that as well. On Friday nights, stay at Greta's, you know, stay at her apartment, get up super early in the morning, hitchhike back to Buena Vista for a Saturday morning raft trip. I did that most of the summer. It was crazy. But it was my life at the time. So also back at the Rocks where I was camping, I had met a couple other guys from another raft company called Buffalo Joe's in town, Terry and Brian Huntsberger, who's till this day are some of my best friends in the world. But they needed a place to camp, so I introduced them to the Rocks. So I wasn't alone at the Rocks anymore. I had these guys camping with me, and then my friend Ron Rupert from Buffalo Joe's moved up there, and just we ended up having 10 to 20 people at any given time camping up there. People would just come up and camp for a couple nights. People lived up there, and that's how the Rocks became like a famous area to camp, or an infamous, however you think about it, area to camp outside of Buena Vista. And I think it still is. It's about 10 years ago now. I was driving through there and I stopped and hiked up to the Rocks. There was nobody up there, but when I go there, it brings back like this wave of memories of living up there for 3 summers. I ended up living there for raft guiding, living in the tent in the Rocks, and just having
the time of my life.